getting now into the collection plan, and the first portion of which is focused on care. So in our collection plan report, I definitely recommend spending just like a brief moment of like 1 page maybe, talking about the goals of the collection plan, what the purpose of the collection plan is, and grounding it in whatever sort of context that seems um, more able to inform and provide that information as to why are we doing the collection plan now, how that informs what we needed to help with, and what its job is. So providing that grounding information of your collection plan report before you get into the details of it, even if this information seems obvious to you. For the collection plan part, some of our content can include storage, which can be the space and the setup of it. And for purposes today, we'll focus on the physicality, so physical collections, physical storage, etc. We have and will again talk about digital collections management a little later on this year. So just know that if you have those questions, we can definitely cover that in the next couple of months. And with that, talking about storage supplies and preservation supplies as part of this area. And when we go through these areas in a bit more detail, I want you to think of the framing as, based on these areas, where can we make improvements? So whether you are just starting out, you're reevaluating or establishing or reestablishing any sort of collections care, best practice, etc. As we go through the prompts, think about for your collections plan, how you can frame it, what sort of additional detail do you need to provide, what questions do you need to ask, that kind of thing. All right, so storage. Collection safe storage refers to both the storage facilities, so the actual location, temperature and humidity control, security of that location, as well as the actual storage material. So any sort of boxes, trays, folders, encapsulate, whatever it is that is actually like holding the item or your collection in general, in terms of materials. And for storage, collection items are typically older and more fragile, no matter what sort of collection you have. That is fairly universal for all of our collections, is that they're older and more fragile, and they can be very susceptible to the temperature and humidity fluctuations, sensitive to overexposure of light, any sort of acid transfer from either wood or deteriorating papers around it, especially if it's not in specific like museum or archival quality storage housing. Pests, of course, and then any sort of disasters that it may be susceptible to, such as fire, water, whether that's leaks, floods, or the fire suppression system, and earthquakes. So there are things inherent in the collection to assess and mitigate. There are areas around the actual storage of that item in terms of the storage materials or the location, and any other sort of outside influences, or as the insurance calls it, acts of God, that could impact your collections based on what it's stored in, where it's stored at, and those outside influences. So quite a bit to think about. For the space, there are some considerations of the collection to keep in mind. First, the security of the space. So thinking about if there are locks or key cards that limit who has access to the collections, even within your own staff. It usually is not necessary for everyone to have access to the collections depending on their jobs. So having an idea of who has access, how that's controlled, if it's keys, key card, locks, etc. Security cameras and or security personnel, depending on what your storage location site logistics are in terms of where it's located, how big it is, what your financial resources are, etc. So considering all of those aspects of security as they may be appropriate for your setup. For the climate controlled aspects of the space, we want to think about, at a minimum, the temperature control and trying to keep it for most of our collections between that 65 to maybe 72 for our collections. Again, if you have collections, sometimes it needs to be colder and drier. Sometimes it can't be that cold or what have you, but for the most part, keeping it consistent and keeping it cool and dry, which is the next part, that humidity control and being desirable to keep it cool and dry. Again, for the majority of our collections, you may have some items that differ. And for that humidity piece, though, depending on where you are geographically located, depending on your building and whether or not it is, to what degree it is climate controlled, which includes temperature and humidity, there may be more or less urgency for you in terms of controlling that humidity gauge. We also want to think about the shelving, specifically metal shelving that has a particular coating on it so that it doesn't rust. And definitely make sure it's not wooden shelving if you can at all avoid it, because wood is acidic. And so thinking about the type of shelving you have in place, if it's the right type of metal, if it's rust proof. Also the logistics of making sure it's not so tall that it's going to cause any structural issues to your flooring, especially if it's not on the whatever the first floor is. But also making sure that it is not too tall, that it's impossible to reach or put things, store items and retrieve them safely. When possible, and especially if you are considering shelving as part of your reassessment and potential new resource acquisition, thinking about getting compact shelving so that it can maximize the amount of shelving space that you have for your particular storage location. And then with shelving in mind, and especially if you're in the midst of choosing a new storage location or trying to get the evidence and argument for an increased storage location size, making sure that you have a room large enough to not just account for your current collection, but to also account for any sort of collection growth, as the majority of us are usually still actively collecting. And yet we also suffer from not enough space or perhaps no space. So really needing to account for that collection growth when at all possible. But we'll also cover that again as we get into some deaccessioning a little later. So things to keep in mind for the actual storage space and materials. When we think about space setup, there's the storage space to consider for the collections, but also the working space. And so when you're thinking about your collections care plan piece of this, are there ways that you can improve the workspace as well as the storage space? So trying to think about, is there a workroom space that can be carved out or reassigned that is next to the storage location so that any sort of processing work can be performed right next to where the collections are being stored, which will help you to significantly limit any sort of additional logistics, as well as mitigate any sort of additional risk that you may have to take when you're moving items out of storage for any sort of process work or digitization work, things like that. And when possible, for that workspace, please also consider the humans that need to be in that workspace and the furniture that they will need. I mentioned that somewhat with humor because often chairs and table space are like the last things that people think about for the workroom, as well as I would add plenty of plugins and or like safe extension cords and power strips. So please make sure that there's both furniture as well as safe access to electricity and any other sort of tools like pencils or cleaning stations, hand wipes if there's not a sink in the processing room, and also to help just collections by their nature, especially if they're archival, can be quite dirty or dusty. So needing a way to help clean the actual work and processing space too is important. So the space setup, particularly for a working room area, should also be considered. And then to the storage materials, specifically for what are containing the items or the archival papers. Each format is going to require slightly different storage container or encapsulation solution. So it's going to depend on the stuff that you have. But overall, for much of our collections, it typically requires rehousing materials that are acid free, sometimes buffered if it's a specific photograph type of collection, but essentially any sort of safe material that's not going to alter or damage the item, and in fact, hopefully even protect it or buffer it from any sort of future damage, either from outside influence or from its own like inherent acidity or what have you. So thinking about acid-free boxes or trays for your artifacts or archival collections, thinking about foam, tissue, or other soft moldable materials to help envelop and secure, especially more fragile objects such as a ceramics collection, for example. And then for archives, in addition to those acid-free boxes, usually acid-free folders, interleaving paper, sleeves, etc., depending on the type of items in the archival collection. But again, anything that is going to be acid-free, not add to or make worse any sort of damage that is already on the collections, and hopefully protect it from future damage. And then preservation supplies. So these are always fun to think about, and especially if you're thinking about a grant to help purchase rehousing supplies and improve storage, for example. Preservation supplies can also be very handy depending on the collection that you have and the expertise on staff to use these tools. However, usually a good short list to have is silica packets. They can help with excess moisture. So pretty much in every sort of collection, but especially if it's heavily paper or textile, then having silica packets distributed liberally across your collection is usually very helpful. Thinking about smudge erasers, basically anything that can help easily remove any sort of dirt or residue that has been placed on the majority of object or paper surfaces. Spatulas, which may not always be called spatulas, but help to get in between or help to remove very like thin and stuck items from each other, usually more in archival collections, but I have seen them used in pretty much every circumstance. Thinking of a vacuum, whether it is a document or textile or otherwise just like a preservation specific vacuum with like low threshold power of removing any sort of dirt or debris. So usually there are some very specific and gentle vacuums available for preservation purposes, depending on your collection and the dirt that may be on it. And then thinking about Japanese tissue paper and vegetable cellulose, especially if there's any sort of mending that you need to do with paper, especially though I've also seen it very creatively used on some textile collections, and artist brushes, whether it's for helping to clean particular artifacts or if it's to help distribute something like vegetable cellulose. Having those soft artist brushes of differing sizes can be incredibly helpful as a preservation tool.